Welcome back to the Engineered Impact Podcast. I wanted to talk today about something that I've seen pop up quite a bit in the news lately. Now I don't follow a lot of news. I've talked before about the years I wasted paying attention to politics and the news in general, and what a toxic experience that was. But I do pay a lot of attention to the financial news. And one of the things that I have seen popping up over and over and over again over the last week and a half or so has to do with inflation. And this is a really fascinating topic to me. Inflation is kind of this mysterious thing that we all know exists. But what I found is that a lot of us don't understand it very well. I certainly did not. I've studied it a little bit. I understand it better than I did. But there's still a lot of nuances to it that are interesting. And I don't want to go off into tangents or get too technical today, but I did want to talk about inflation because it's one of the single biggest factors that will influence your ability to be financially free or to retire if that's what your goal is. And so I wanted to come on here today and just talk a little bit about, what is inflation? Why does it happen? Why does it matter to you? And what do we do about it? Okay. And so first off, what is inflation, right? Typically, we kind of tend to think of it as, well, prices go up over time, right? And while that's true, what inflation actually is a decrease in the purchasing power of the dollars in your pocket, right? So it's not that prices just magically increase over time. It's that the value of the dollars in your pocket is decreasing every single year, okay? Now, on average, since 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve System was put in place, and that's a whole other topic we'll probably talk about at some point. But the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. It is neither federal, it is not a government-owned entity, nor does it have any reserves. It's one of the most insolvent institutions on the planet. Okay, but it's the central bank of the United States, and it's the issuer of the U.S. dollar today. Okay, so since the Federal Reserve System was put in place in 1913, the dollar has lost 96.2% of its value. Okay, so what does that mean? It means if something that costs $1 today only cost 3.8 cents in 1913. Okay, or put another way, something you could have bought for 3.8 cents in 1913 costs $1 today, right? To put that in more tangible context, a house that costs you $200,000 today would have cost you less than $8,000 in 1913. Okay, so let that sink in. So what's happening over time is that the central bank is issuing more and more dollars every single year. And this is something, if you look at a chart of the purchasing power of the dollar over time, that decline was kind of slow for a while, and then it accelerated massively starting in the 70s when the early 70s, 1971 is when the United States broke the last vestige of any kind of gold standard where the dollar was tied to anything, right? Since 1971, dollars are created out of thin air, and there's nothing that backs them, right? There's still people that think our dollars are backed by gold or silver or something. That's not true. There is nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States government and its ability to tax you and me that backs the United States dollar, okay? So that's an important thing to understand. So why does inflation happen? Why are they creating all these dollars, right? Well, you've probably noticed that governments like to spend more money than they take in, right? Now, if you or I do that, we go into debt. Eventually, we go bankrupt, right? Governments get their income through taxation, right? The only way the government has any money is if they take it from you or me, right? Typically. But they've discovered this really cool thing where they get a printing press and they can just print as many of these dollars as they need. They don't have to take them from us. They can still take as much as they want from us, but then they can print more. And what that allows them to do is spend money that they don't have on things that they couldn't otherwise do, right? They can go fight crazy wars. They can do tons of welfare programs. They can pay themselves off, right? Government can do a lot more if it can tax us and print money, right? And so that's really what's happening. Um, and I mean, this is nothing new, right? You can go thousands of years back into time, and this is how the Greeks destroyed themselves. This is how the Roman Empire fell. Um, I mean, in school we learned about the Weimar Republic in Germany, and you may remember from school seeing people carrying wheelbarrows full of uh, paper marks to buy a loaf of bread, right? Um, and so when inflation gets really out of hand, you can get a situation called hyperinflation, that's where you get that scenario where the dollar or the currency essentially becomes worthless, and people are trying to get rid of it as fast as they can, right? But typically, what a government tries to do is they try to work this balancing act where the inflation is low enough that nobody really notices over time. I mean, people kind of they know what's going on and they see prices going up, but it's slow enough that nobody really gets too upset, right? Why are they doing this, right? Well, the problem is governments can't spend more than they take in indefinitely, just like you or I couldn't do with our budget, right? Eventually, that's going to catch up to them if they're spending dollars and paying those dollars back honestly, right? Meaning, if they borrow $1 from me, the dollar they give me back is worth the same amount as the dollar I gave them, right? Well, when you get into a situation like the United States is in, where they've racked up now $26+ trillion in debt, there's no possible way they can ever pay that back. It's not mathematically possible they could ever tax us enough to pay that back, right? So what do? Well, they're not going to stop spending, that's for sure, right? And so one sly thing that a government can do is pay back those dollars dishonestly, right? Meaning, I'm going to give you $1 that's worth $1 today, and 10 years from now, you're going to give me $1 that's worth maybe, I don't know, 70 cents today, right? So the dollar that I get back will only buy 70% of what the dollar I gave you will buy, right? Well, that's a great deal for you as the government, because now it's easier for you to pay back all those dollars you borrow, right? But it stinks for me because now I can't do as much with that dollar as I could have if I just spent it myself 10 years ago, right? And so this is what they're doing. Over time, they want inflation. They want a positive inflation rate, meaning they want the value of the currency to decline every single year, because that allows them to continue to service the massive, unsustainable debts that they've racked up, right? Now, eventually this is going to catch up with them. You cannot spend $26 trillion and be trying to constantly add trillion-dollar deficits or multi-trillion-dollar deficits, is where we seem to be going now, every single year, and never have it blow up in your face, right? Eventually this is going to blow up in their face and our face. But that's what they're trying to do, right? Is they want a mildly positive inflation rate that devalues the currency a little bit every year, that's enough to keep the real value of their debt declining, but still be low enough that nobody gets mad enough to bring the pitchforks out, right? Now, unfortunately, governments aren't as smart as they think they are. They don't have as much control over the economy as they'd like to think they do, and so, eventually it gets out of hand. But that's the idea. That's their theory. That's what they're trying to do. So, why does this matter to you, right? Well, 3% may not sound like a lot, right? And from one year to the next, it's not, right? If your gas bill goes up 3% a year, if a cost of food goes up 3% a year, nobody notices too much, right? But what happens over time is that those 3% a year add up, right? And so over the course of like a 40-year career at 3% interest, the value of your dollars will lose 70% of their value, right? So if you show up to work as a 22-year-old kid and put $1 in your 401k, by the time you retire in 40 years, that dollar is only going to be worth 30 cents, right? Meaning the purchasing power is only 30% of what it was when you saved that dollar, okay? Well, that's a big problem. Now, if you've been following me for any length of time, you've probably heard the story I've shared before, that a few years back, I realized that I didn't really have a sense of how much money was going to be enough to allow me to retire on, right? I wanted to retire when I was 55. I figured I'd live till 95. 40 years seemed like a good long retirement. And I wanted to maintain my standard of living that I enjoyed at that time, which At the time, I think I was making somewhere in the neighborhood of 90K. All right. So I'm an engineer. I did what every good engineer does. I pulled up Excel and I started crunching numbers, right? And I figured out, okay, if I'm saving this much a year, my income is going to go up by X percent. And I did my best to figure in, what are management fees going to cost me? What are tax rates going to be over that lifetime? What's inflation going to do to me over that lifetime, right? And what I tried to figure out is how much money do I need to, when I retire, so that I can draw down basically $90,000, the equivalent of $90,000 worth of income through age 95, right? And so $90,000 at that point, which I think this was like 2016, was going to be a much bigger number by the time I retired when I was 55. And to be able to draw the equivalent of $90,000 in income off of that by the time I was 95, it's a massively different number, right? So when I crunched all these numbers, the number at the bottom that told me how much I was going to need by the time I was 55 to retire was $8.3 million. Okay. Now I looked at that number and I was like, there's no way. That is not possible, right? So I started going through my numbers, couldn't find anything wrong. So I was like, all right, it's got to be right. So then I figured out, well, how much am I going to make in my career? So I went to another column and I started making estimates on, how much is my income going to go up, factored in a few promotions here and there. And I figured I was only going to make like $5.5 million my entire career. I was like, oh, now it's an even bigger problem, right? I'm not going to make anywhere near that much. I don't really have any confidence that I can save enough and get the kinds of rates of return that I'm going to need to save $8.3 million. So I'm toast, right? There's no way I can maintain my lifestyle. I've got to just start figuring out how to reduce my expectations, right? Unfortunately, that did not sound very acceptable to me, so I kept looking. I found some other things to do. Talked about those before, right? The point that matters today is that $8.3 million was a legitimate number, okay? Now, I know your financial advisor is going to tell you things like you're going to be in a lower tax bracket. You're not going to need as much income, right? I don't want to be poor when I retire. That just doesn't sound cool to me, right? This idea of working for 40 years and then retiring to be poorer than I am and reducing my lifestyle just doesn't sound cool. So I'm not willing to accept that. But what that means is I have to find a way to either come up with $8.3 million or I've got to find some other way to make sure that I can fund that kind of a lifestyle no matter how long I live, right? And that's another thing. Like, what if I live to 115, right? That 8.3 wasn't going to be sufficient anymore. Okay. So the reason this matters is of all those things that I looked at that were eroding the purchasing power of my retirement savings or eroding my retirement savings, the taxes, the management fees, inflation far and away was the biggest factor that was pumping that number up, right? That was the biggest thing that was working against me, was the fact that the United States government has to reduce the purchasing power of my dollars every single year to keep themselves sort of almost solvent, right? They're never going to stop doing that. So this is a problem. Now, whether you are trying to retire early, whether you are cool with the 40-year plan, you want to retire, 55, 65, kind of a more traditional retirement age, inflation is something you have to factor into your plan, because if you don't, it will destroy you. Okay. It will eat your savings way faster than you understand or than you're planning for, and you'll find yourself in the middle of retirement unable to meet your expenses and having to drastically reduce your lifestyle. Okay. So that's the problem. The United States government is heavily incentivized to continue to do this. That's going to hurt you. Okay. And so the question then is, what do you do about it, right? How do you address this? How do you plan for this? How can you invest so that you can be confident that whether you live to 85 or 95 or 115, you are going to be able to fund the lifestyle that you want, okay, and be able to enjoy the kind of retirement that you want. So this video is already getting a little bit long. That's what we're going to cover next time. But keep this in mind. If you don't already have this factored into the amount of money that you're targeting to have saved for retirement, you need to either sit down and do some serious number crunching. You need to sit down with your financial advisor and have a very frank conversation about the impact that this is going to have. Because the models that most of them running, I don't think are going to adequately factor this in. Okay, even if inflation stays at a moderate 3% clip, like it has over the last 107 years, like I said, over the course of 40 years, that's a 70% decline in your purchasing power. Okay, so whether you're planning yourself, whether you're working with a pro, if you're not taking this into account, it'll eat you alive. So next time we'll talk about some things that you can do to mitigate the effects of inflation. But in the meantime, take a look at your plan, take a look at how inflation is factored into that, if it's factored in at all, and get clear about what impact that'll have on your savings goals. All right, so that's your homework for tonight. I will catch you in the next episode.